Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I continue to thank you for your incredible support. I do hope you're going to get yourself something effervescent and sparkling to drink, or maybe something warm and comforting, but whatever it is, let me know about it if I haven't heard about it before, because I do love hearing from you. But before we get started with our story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I hated driving at night with a passion, but what could I do? I was tired of being alone, so I had to overcome my vacillating reservations or lingering hesitancy and meet up with my blind date in town that I had communicated with on a dating app. Suffice to say, I had no idea how many toads I would meet until I found my Prince Charming. Whether I'd actually meet the special person was debatable, but I was hanging on to the hope that one day I would ultimately find him. But in 3 years of continuous disasters, I was beginning to lose faith. For goodness sake, dear, my mother had told me on numerous occasions, shaking her head furiously, as if she was despairing with me. Don't demean yourself, Cassandra, by going on all those dating websites. The more you look for the man of your dreams, the less chance you have of actually finding him. It's when you're not looking that he'll magically appear. My mother was a romantic at heart, that believed in an ethereal world where magic lamps could be rubbed and wishes could be granted. We can't all be like you, Mum, I said gingerly, unable to disguise the annoyance in my voice. Why could my mother not keep her nose out of my business? She really could be quite intrusive at times. I could count on my hands over a dozen times when she had tried very unsuccessfully, I might add, to set me up on a date. I think she fancied herself as the quintessential matchmaker. She would invite a rather poor, unsuspecting young man, whom she deemed an eligible bachelor, to our home, under the clever guise that she needed some help with some light bulbs that were on the blink, and then drag the kind young man into our home and insist he stayed on for dinner. I very much doubt the man could possibly say no. My mother could be most insistent when she chose. It was difficult to sometimes get a word in edgeways. Oh, but I insist! You must stay for dinner. You've gone out of your way to help me. Now let me return the favour. She would look at the young man with her earnest but pleading blue eyes, and they rarely ever refused her. I always wondered what our guest must think, as my perfectly capable father would make an appearance and join us at the dinner table, who they must have realised was competent enough to fix the problematic issue with the lights for my mother. I would come along and sit at the table, to find my mother flapping over the young man like a flustered pigeon, piling his plate high with potatoes and meatloaf. My mother was a fabulous cook, so I suppose the young man didn't completely draw the short straw. Mark, I'd like you to meet my daughter Cassandra, she would say, with a mischievous glint in her eyes that would make me inwardly groan, sometimes even squirm with embarrassment. Some of the young men my mother brought home with her were not my type at all. My mother had no way of knowing that. If he was young, carefree and single, it seemed like he ticked all the boxes in her opinion. My mother could be transparent like a pane of glass, and I knew exactly what she was up to. She didn't fool me for a moment. The young man would give me a polite nod, which I would dutifully return. Mark here kindly offered to fix the light bulb in the living room that was on the blink. It was so terribly nice of him. He insisted on helping me. We met at the supermarket, and I happened to mention our issue with the electricity. My father would furrow his forehead in perplexment. What issue, sweetheart? We don't have any issue with electricity, he would say. Why did you not ask me to fix the problem, dear? I'm quite sure Mark here has other things he'd rather be doing than coming over to our house to fix very minor problems for us. The man whom had been dragged to our house with my mother would always say something like, It's only a pleasure. I was glad to be of help. Well, Can you believe it? There was no problem with the lamp after all. I failed to put the plug in the electric socket, would you believe? No wonder it didn't work. My mother would giggle. Silly me. I must have my head in the clouds. I probably pulled out the connection when I was hoovering the house and forgot to replace it. No wonder the lamp didn't work. It wasn't a dodgy light bulb after all. But never you mind, she would say obsequiously. I'm so glad you've joined us for dinner, Mark. Now you must tell us all about yourself. My mother would give me a wink, and I seriously wanted to throttle her. My mother was like a cat that brings her owner a dead bird, who thinks that she's given you a spectacular gift when the reverse is true. My mother was the same as a presumptuous tabby cat, and it would drive me completely insane. It was not up to her to find me a suitable mate. I so wished she'd keep her interfering butt out of my business with her Jim will fix it mentality. My mother could be brazen if needs must. She would seek out good-looking men in the supermarket or anywhere else for that matter that tickled her fancy, and prey on her unsuspecting victims with the vigour of a female praying mantis. My father was blindly oblivious to my mother's unsubtle, rather ungainly attempts to match-make me with a young man, but she failed exponentially in her endeavours, as much of the men she harpooned were completely unaware of my mother's matchmaking agenda. My mother came from a generation that failed to comprehend the changing times we live in. She had met my father when she tripped in a parking lot on her high-heeled shoes and sprained her ankle rather badly. My father had taken her to the ER to get her ankle checked out, and when she was given the all clear, he insisted on taking her out to lunch. I am so pleased you didn't break your ankle. I was rather worried about that, my father had told her. But you will almost certainly break my heart if you don't agree to come out for lunch with me. And that had been that. So let's just say a budding romance blossomed between the two of them, and in 6 months they were married. My father admitted to seeing my mother in the parking lot as he was returning to his own car, and thinking how he wished he had the brazen confidence to go up to her and introduce himself. But his reserved reticence overcame him. But had my mother not serendipitously fallen over, they'd have been like two passing ships in the night. So fate favoured them, and my mother would say, I knew one day that my Prince Charming would whisk me off my feet. And just like that, your father rescued me in the parking lot, she would say, with a naughty twinkle in her eye, which would sometimes make me wonder if my mother's fortuitous sprained ankle had really been legitimate. But she insisted it was. My parents had an enviable relationship. My father adored my mother, and vice versa. Their relationship was a hard act to follow, for it had made me not want to settle for anything less than the best, which may not be a good example. It's rather like buying a pair of jeans, but one might be wise to ensure the fabric has a little give. But for me, my perception of a relationship fit into a tight mould, with absolutely no elasticity or give whatsoever. They had set me impossible high standards. It's a bit like buying the best imported wild smoked salmon from Scotland. You might find a cheaper alternative, very inferior at the store, but boy, can you taste the difference. I just knew that I had impossibly high expectations in relationships based on my parents' exemplary example, which was why I had been through hiccups and a plethora of relationships myself, which had ended as quickly as the stage curtains in a theatre being drawn. I was not going to stay in a relationship if I nursed any doubts or reservations. Maybe that was my major problem. Maybe I needed to give the men in my life a fighting chance, as perfection simply did not exist. I knew that, of course, but what I wanted more than anything in the world was a man who made me laugh, and a good sense of humour would not hurt. I seemed to attract into my life men who were incredibly serious. I remember one of my dates I had a rendezvous with was a man that had such a glum expression on his face, as if the world was folding in on him from every corner. He shook his head grimly, staring at me with wide, alarmed eyes, and said, I'm very worried about this climate change. The world is heating up at an alarming rate. One day we might actually cook under the sun and fry like eggs. And I mean that literally. It could happen, you know. If we don't do something to stop it now, he said, beating the table angrily with his fist. I must have really ruffled his feathers as I said, "I'm sorry, I don't really believe in climate change. I believe it's a conspiracy theory. Don't you see the elites in our world? They run the world behind our government. They want an excuse to get more and more wealthy by promoting all the green products they sell to us. They want us to snap up their narratives that they feed us through the media like hungry crocodiles, so that they have the quintessential excuse to tear down our rainforests, ruin our natural habitats at will, and drill. I promise you, many scientists say the world goes through natural rhythms of hot and cold cycles, and the heat we've been experiencing of late has existed before. It's a cycle, don't you see? And anyway, if we've got anything to worry about, it's more the cold weather that should concern us. Do you have any idea how many people die from freezing conditions? It's thousands, I believe. Anyway, getting back to my point, the elites use our people in power like puppets who aren't really running the show. And they always have a duplicitous agenda. They feed us the narratives they want us to believe. It's been going on since the 40s. I've done my research. I know what I'm talking about. My date looked at me as if I was as loopy as a fruit cake. "The world is getting hotter," he insisted. "The science is backing it all up. How can you possibly talk such nonsense? We've been having dozens of heat waves. The world has never seen anything like this before. People have been dying in these heat waves, dropping dead like flies, and you suggest it's a conspiracy theory." He grimaced and continued, "Lady, I don't know what you're smoking, or where you get your ludicrous claims from, but I assure you that you ain't got a clue what you're talking about." He rattled on and on and on about climate change. I was getting so bored. It was clearly his favourite subject to discuss. I remember getting sympathetic glances from people sitting at other tables as my boring date droned on and on. Even if he was right about climate change, I didn't take offence to his comments. I'm happy to admit if I'm wrong about something, but let's just say this man's intensity drove me away from him faster than seals escaping an orca. He certainly killed my desire to ever see him again. Even if we couldn't agree on climate change, we couldn't agree on anything else, it would seem, and someone who takes themselves far too seriously is a no-no for me, a red warning flag you would do well to avoid. All my dates had been an absolute disaster, one after another, and I would have given up on this hot pursuit a long time ago. If anything was suffering from climate change, it was the hot disappointment of my dating life that would invariably end up in a puddle of disappointment like a pothole on the side of the road filled with rainwater. The reason I was pursuing my dating life with such a zestful, ardent vigour was I was being driven by the dreadful, pervasive fear of being alone all of my life, and living with that dreadful thought was not something I could comfortably digest. Suffice to say, I know a lot of people who live on their own and claim to thoroughly enjoy their independence, but I've always been a believer that two is better than one. If one falls down, the other can help him up. But what do you do in a helpless situation when you're all on your own and you need help? People never rarely discuss the subject of loneliness, and so often brush it under the carpet, as if it's a dirty word we should be ashamed about. I did not have a monopoly on this. There are so many lonely people in the world, and I was no exception. I'd heard stories of elderly people before, forgotten and neglected, dying alone in their own homes, no one knowing about their dreadful fate until someone in the neighbourhood ultimately picks up a bad, sickly, sweet smell of decomposition, death and decay. They soon discover that the elderly person died alone, left in their desolate isolation, as if no one cared. I'm sure people in that neighbourhood would be riddled with guilt, knowing that they could have been a better neighbour and played their intrinsic part in looking in on someone who lives alone and being a friend to them. But what can you do about hindsight? Not much at all. I knew all too well about these stories. I think working at a funeral parlour meant that what I was doing that night when I travelled to town to meet up with a date had become so much more urgent to me. I was eager to find that quintessential person to spend the rest of my life with. They had to be out there, surely. When you see death so close up and personal, as you do when you work in a funeral home, it makes you all the more determined to live life to the fullest. You realise that life can be fleeting. I didn't tell my blind dates that I worked at a funeral parlour. It was a conversation stopper, that's for sure. I find people don't want to talk about death. It's not a subject that many are eager to talk about, and who can blame them for feeling this way? Certainly before I worked at the parlour, death was a taboo subject that I didn't want to entertain in my daily life. If you did not think about death, you could pretend it didn't exist, until it personally affected you when you lost someone you loved. I would naturally tell people I met that I worked for a company organising their administration, which in a way was part true, although I was often expected to deal with the bereaved if the funeral home was short-staffed. The day I'm going to tell you about in my story is a day indelibly marked on my mind, for it is a day I shan't ever forget. I'm sure you've heard of the saying that when it rains it ultimately pours. What that means is that your life can roll smoothly along a very uneventful, very predictable regimental course, and then one day the routines of your life spin off their axis, rather like a merry-go-round coming off its hinges. That's what ultimately happened on this day to me, when everything that transpired from beginning to end was exceedingly peculiar, and this was that day for me that made me really begin to wonder about the world we lived in, which is ultimately not as straightforward and as clear-cut as I thought it was. It all began rather inauspiciously when I arrived at the funeral home in the morning to discover that the two main key players who ran the parlour, Mr. and Mrs. Savage, were both very poorly. It would seem that they'd been to a fish restaurant the previous evening and were both throwing up violently. "Oh, I think it was the prawns I ate last night. They tasted very suspicious." "I hate to do this to you, Cassandra," Maureen said to me. "I know you only work 4 mornings a week, but could you work the entire day for me? I really need you to do this for me. We're in a dreadful pickle. I'm constantly throwing up. Let's just say Jack and I are in a very bad way. We've had a dreadful dose of food poisoning. Do you mind overseeing everything yourself, Cassandra?" "Of course I don't mind, Maureen," I said, biting my lips uneasily. "Oh, you are a lifesaver, Cassandra. I am quite sure you're going to manage on your own superbly. You're very good with our clients, and this is your perfect opportunity to shine, to show us what you are made of." In truth, I felt out of my depth, as if I'd been thrown mercilessly to a hungry pack of wolves. Thank God the embalmer was around, and Ted Morris and Billy Young, who took care of the cold room and general maintenance and cleaning at the mortuary. They also drove the funeral van to collect deceased bodies, to bring them back to the home for cold storage until they were finally released for burial and cremation. When you work in a privately run funeral home, or a family-owned business, so to speak, it's hands on deck all the time. All hands, I'm talking about. You can find yourself doing anything, from cleaning the toilets to organising headstones for the deceased loved ones. Ostensibly, the day started with a vulgar, bitter taste in my mouth, as you would have expected, but I surprised myself by handling things pretty seamlessly, answering calls attentively, and attending to a young woman whose husband had died in a car accident, about the funeral arrangements for Matt Granger, her husband. How I wished Maureen was here to handle this. She had that sympathetic bedside manner. I was quite reticent by nature, not always good at expressing my emotions. Sometimes I'd feel uncomfortable if people broke down in tears, which happened quite a lot. "Do come in, Mrs. Granger," I said to her kindly. "I'm terribly sorry for your loss." The brave woman was trying to be courageously stoic, but her blue eyes looked glazed, and the tears spilled down her face. Oh dear me, you've got to excuse me. It's such a dreadful shock." "Of course it is," I said, guiding her to a chair, so that the woman could sit down. She looked like many of our clients when they'd had a bad shock. Red puffy eyes, rudely framed by conspicuous dark circles. "Now you relax, Mrs. Granger. Can I get you a glass of water, or a sweet cup of tea? The sugar might help you," I said, while I handed her a box of tissues. Oh no, it's terribly kind of you," she said, sniffing, and dabbing her eyes with a tissue that she gratefully pulled out of the box. I really need to get this over and done with. My daughter wanted to come with me today, but she's an emotional mess. She and her father were incredibly close. I thought I could handle this myself. I've been so composed until now. I don't know what's happening to me. Well, maybe the shock is wearing off, I said, and the reality is hitting you hard. You make a very good point. That must be it. I could see she felt embarrassed about her emotional outburst, which I tried to assure her was perfectly normal and perfectly natural. Dear, oh dear, honestly, what am I like? If I carry on this way, I'll never get this funeral arranged. She fumbled in her large leather purse and pulled out a photograph of her husband and handed it over to me. That's what I want. I'd like you to print this photograph. I want it on the funeral programme, you see. I studied the picture and gave her a warm smile. Your husband was very handsome, I said, admiring the hazel eyes staring back at me through the photograph and the shock of silvery hair. Is this an old picture of him? I asked her. Heavens, no. It was only taken last week, would you believe it? He was 7 years younger than me, you know, my husband. He always told me I'd outlive him. He's 52 in that picture, but he doesn't look a day over 40, does he? He kept me young, you know. He had such a passion for life. I called him my silver fox with his striking grey hair. He turned completely grey when he was 25 after his father's death. It was quite extraordinary, but it really suited him. He does look like a lovely person, I agreed. And cheeky too, said the woman, giggling. Oh, such a practical joker. He made me laugh so much. Oh, I'm really going to miss him. No one made me laugh quite like he did. Last Thanksgiving, he put so many coins in the Christmas pudding, which is an English tradition, you know. They wrap up the coins and put it in the pudding. Well, he hooted with laughter when we all nearly broke our teeth on the coins. I don't think he'd have found it quite so funny if he'd been saddled with an exorbitant dental bill. You know, he made life terribly fun. He had such a fabulous sense of humour. It was a very attractive quality in him, she said, shaking her head sadly. We haven't received his body yet, I told her, but I am informed that the medical examiner has been in touch with you, and the autopsy is now complete. That's correct, she told me. Are you intending to cremate him or bury him? Oh, a burial, most definitely. Matt was quite happy to be devoured by worms. It was the thought of being burnt to a cinder he couldn't abide. Would you like to see the coffins we have available? I asked her. Mrs. Granger nodded sorrowfully. I suppose now is as good as ever. Isn't it funny? A week ago I would never imagine I'd be doing this. Life can be so terribly cruel at times. You'll be surprised, I said, how many people say what you've just said, almost word for word. Maybe it's a good thing we don't always know what the future holds, or we might be quite afraid to live our lives. You make an excellent point there, said Mrs. Granger, blowing her nose hard in a tissue. I led her to our display room so that she could study the coffins. If Matt had his way, she laughed, he'd be buried in a tomato box. Do you know we were talking about death, I think a year ago it was, and he informed me he'd like to be buried in a tomato box and lowered into the ground with strings. He didn't do with all this fancy stuff. I better pick something middle of the range. Anything too extravagant or ornate, he'll be turning in his grave. He'd consider it a complete waste of money to splash out on him in his death. In the end, Mrs. Granger settled for a walnut-coloured coffin with a luxurious velvety lining. That will do very nicely, she told me, although if Matt were here, he would say it was far too over the top, very extravagant. But I'm arranging his funeral for him. He's not in charge now. I gave Matt Granger's funeral arrangements no further thought, until Ted Morris and Billy Young wheeled in the deceased body of Matt Granger on the trolley, through to cold storage. I looked up at them from my phone, as I was speaking to another client. I waved at them and smiled. I was surprised to see another man wheeling the trolley in with them. He looked up at me with a warm smile and friendly eyes. He had a magnificent mop of thick silvery hair. I clandestinely wondered where I knew him from. He looked strangely familiar. The man gave me a cheeky wink. I automatically assumed that Ted and Billy had recruited somebody else to help them with their jobs that day, given that both Mr. and Mrs. Savage, who ran the parlour, were indisposed, and could not lend a helping hand. Later on in the morning, the very same man with the silvery hair and piercing eyes walked past me. He gave me a warm, friendly nod and another cheeky wink. I didn't know why he looked so startlingly familiar. Where had I seen him before? He then dropped a ring on the table in front of me. I asked him if it was Natalie Granger's husband's ring that she had asked us to remove from her husband's corpse. He nodded. I quickly examined the ring, which I placed in a manila envelope, which I marked for the attention of Mrs. Granger. I was about to ask the man why he looked so familiar and where I knew him from, but when I looked up at him, he was gone. I was more than a little puzzled, as I hadn't seen him walking away, and those floors made quite a noise in the parlour. How strange, I thought, feeling perturbed. Why had the man seemed so familiar to me? I don't mind admitting that it really niggled me somewhat. I tried to brainstorm who he was and where I'd seen him before. I called Mrs. Granger to say that we had her husband's wedding ring for her to collect. I saw Ted Morris and Billy a couple more times that day, wheeling in yet another deceased body. I noticed their friend with the silver hair was helping them. It was so typical, a busy day for us, when I happen to be on duty and Mr. and Mrs. Savage are unavailable. We received 3 dead bodies in one morning. I could hardly believe it. "Thank goodness you had help today," I told Ted and Billy. "I could see you were run off your feet. It's been hectic today." They looked at me bemused. "What do you mean?" they asked me. "We didn't have any help today. What are you talking about, Cassandra?" "I mean the very nice man with the silvery hair that helped you wheel in the trolleys." "There was no one wheeling the trolleys with us," they insisted. "But I saw you with him," I insisted. "He was helping you carry the trolleys into the code room." I retrieved the manila envelope to show the baffled men, explaining to them that the man with the silver hair had removed the wedding band from Matt's body and brought it over to me to give to Mrs. Granger, who had requested the band. Both men paled. "But we looked for the wedding band. It wasn't on his finger. We were going to inform you about this, but we were rushed off our feet." I raised my hand like a lollipop woman at a pedestrian crossing. "Hold on," I said, and went over to Matt Granger's photograph. That was when my skin paled. "This is the man I saw helping you wheel in the dead bodies," I said, showing the men the photograph. My blood ran cold at this revelation. It was Matt Granger, who had already died. He had been helping the men wheel in dead bodies all morning. I'd seen his ghost, and yet he had looked as real as you and me. But there was no doubt in my mind that I had seen him very clearly. Matt Granger's own ghost had personally handed me his wedding band from his own corpse. I mean, how does that even happen? In that moment I realized that the human soul must live forever, that we don't actually even die. "I told you the cold room was unnaturally cold this morning," said Ted to his friend. "I could feel a presence, but you pooh-poohed me," he said accusingly. I think all 3 of us felt a little spooked after that event. But let's just say Mrs. Granger was right. Even in death, her husband appeared to have a good sense of humour. Little did I know that the day was going to get increasingly more idiosyncratic and outlandish, if that was at all possible. I'd arranged to meet my blind date in Seattle. The funeral parlour was situated 40 minutes outside Seattle in the countryside, and my home was 15 minutes from work. I lived in a little cottage on my parents' property, so that I could enjoy my own independence. By all accounts, it was far too expensive for me to rent my own place, and I also had to help my father manage his extensive vegetable plot, where much of the produce was sold to organic storeholders. I had promised to meet my date at about 6:30, as I was running late. I would have to go to the Rendezvous, an Italian restaurant, wearing my black jacket and trousers that I wore to the parlour every day, which was a standard uniform for us. It was too late to go home and change, so I just applied some lip gloss and straightened my hair, although on reflection, why I bothered, God only knows. I thought with the day having been so topsy-turvy, that maybe against all the odds, my date might actually turn out to be an exciting surprise, like a gift in a Christmas cracker, not the predictable plastic toy that you might expect, but something infinitely more special. But as usual, I was to be bitterly disappointed. My date was waiting for me, somewhat impatiently I might add. I was ushered to the table by the waiter. My date had the audacity to point to his watch and say, "You're 10 minutes late." I made a joke about how it was a woman's prerogative to be late, to which he scowled. I didn't even see a slight tweaking of the lips, which suggested that an inflated beach ball had more personality than he did. I knew that this meal was going to be a rough, tumultuous ride, and that I needed to brace myself for the journey, for it was going to be a tortuously dull one. It was a pity that this man on paper looked like he ticked all the boxes. He was handsome and well built, but was as uninspiring as a champagne without its fizz. I knew the moment I sat down at the table that I wanted to leave. I only accepted a dinner date with him as he had insisted that meeting for coffee was just way too short to get to know anyone. Foolishly, I had agreed to his proposition, only because I had been somewhat beguiled by his attractive photograph. More fool me. That's all I can say. Appearances can be remarkably deceptive, and charm he had not. "So what do you do?" he asked me, taking a large mouthful of gnocchi. This time I thought I'd lay my cards on the table and tell him the truth, and it might make the evening much less dull. "Oh, I work at a funeral parlour," I said, expecting to stun him into silence. "That's nice. It must be a pleasure to work with people who don't talk. I work in an office where the people don't bloody shut up for a moment. It's an absolute nightmare. Natter, 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 all day long. It drives me insane." "So you're not social then?" I asked. "Absolutely not. I like to keep myself to myself. If people at work didn't gossip as much as they did, the productivity would improve exponentially. I tell them that all the time. Do you know my secretary had the brass nerve to call me a cold fish the other day?" I remember thinking to myself privately, his secretary was spot on. He was a cold fish. At the end of the meal, my date was offended when I offered to pay, asking me when he'd see me again. "Look, it's very nice to meet you, but really I think I'd prefer it if we remained friends," I told him. "Why do women always say that to me?" he groaned. "Because you're a bore," I said to myself in my head. And with that secret thought on my mind, I hastily made my exit to the parking lot, where the driver's seat of my car welcomed me warmly. Never was I more grateful to see my car. I simply couldn't wait to get back home. It had been a very long, tiring day, and I was exhausted and deflated. I was dreaming of sinking into a lovely hot bubble bath and enjoying a glass of white wine. But little did I know that my day was far from over, and in many ways it had only just begun. So there we are. That's the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I can't wait to learn about this lovely Bigfoot encounter. So until next time, goodbye and good night.